Been listening to a lot of serious serious scholarship. This is the point to relax, kick your shoes off, wriggle your toes, because I'm just going to tell you a story. It's the story of the celebration of athletic victory in the 6th century BC. To some extent, it's the story of a mirage, the story of the victory ode. The victory ode has captured the European imagination. It helped to define lyric for millennia. It captured the Greek imagination as well, and yet it was always a hothouse flower. It depended on a very fragile ecosystem, and the minute the ecosystem came under threat, the Epinicean too disappeared. This is also the story of a remarkable period of fluidity in the memorialization of victory. As we all know, there is an explosion of athletic activity in the first third of the 6th century BC. That leap immediately generates a need for memorialization. It's worth bearing in mind that the factors that bring this explosion in athletics are very much tied to the rise of the independent polis, which has reached its classic form by the 6th century BC. This creates new opportunities for the relationship between citizen and city, new senses of civic identity, and new ways to memorialize. There we go. Already by the late 5th, in the 6th century, there is a strong tendency towards civic memorialization of athletic success. It's already well enough established for Xenophanes, the philosopher, to grumble about it. I've given you his text there. A lot of sour grapes, I think, on public display, and probably a very lonely voice in the context of Greek society. The athletic explosion means far more successes to celebrate and a demand for new ways to recognize the significance of athletic success. Some of the rewards for athletes are actually long-term ones. The Athenian free meals for life, the Spartan reward of allowing successful Olympic athletes to fight alongside the king in the forefront of the battle. These convey lasting prestige. Some of the other rewards are invisible, the civic cash prizes to athletes, and therefore they do very little in terms of one's public visibility. By the middle of the 5th century, there is a strong desire for some sort of lasting record in public space. And it's at this point that we get the rise of the athletic inscription. Begins in the first third of the 6th century BC. Probably the thing worth noting most of all, I'll come back to Phrasycleia in a minute. Sorry, there we go. The thing that's worth noting, I think, above all here is the speed of the reaction of poets and stonemasons to the new market. Almost the minute that the Panhellenic Games come into being, we're starting to see memorialization in the victor's city in the form of athletic inscriptions. Usually, in fact, very terse. I've given you one there from the mid-6th century. A couple more here. They're normally attached to objects which are dedicated. These might actually be statues. They might be things like a discus or jumping weights. One of the most striking things about them, and this is relevant to the rise of the victory ode, is the terseness. They're very rarely elaborated. They don't normally give a lot of details, and they seem to be based on a dialogic relationship with their readership. There is an assumption, I think, that you know the facts, and these are memory joggers, I think, rather than detailed records. Sorry. They obviously do fulfill a need, but there we go. They have their limitations. Recent scholarship has rightly stressed the Panhellenic nature of Greek inscriptions. The same forms appear across the whole of the Greek world. And recent scholarship as well has tended to stress the performative nature of Greek inscriptions. This is my favourite of all the archaic Greek inscriptions. It's the Phrasikleia inscription, an exquisite text, and of course accompanying a beautiful statue. These are performed texts in the sense that they usually or frequently speak to you. Aristis dedicated me. The inscription itself usually speaks to you, the object or the stone. They're also performed in another sense, and that is, of course, this is an age when people read aloud, and therefore you perform the text when you read the inscription. But paradoxically, although they're public monuments, they also are limited public monuments. They are experienced privately. One doesn't actually read these collectively. You read them as an individual. So they are public monuments with limitations in terms of their public impact. They're also limited in another sense, of course, and that is, although scholarship stresses the Pan-Hellenic nature of the inscription, they sit stolid in their own local space. So they have their limitations. There is obviously, round about this time, a perceived need for recognition in real time. That is, recognition which is actually experienced and not merely left to lie, and public recognition in terms of public performance. And this, in turn, generates yet another response to market need, and that is, of course, the Victory Ode. The Victory Ode, in its classic form, is the product of a Pan-Hellenic poet, a renowned poet, who is bought in to produce a celebration. I don't know how much these things cost, but my bet would be megabucks. I don't think that they're for the financially straitened. I think they cost a lot of money. One advantage of these poems, I should say, in fact, that they have a pedigree behind them. We know that there were always, we know that there was a long history of impromptu performances. I've given you there Pindar's Olympian 9, where he talks about a song attributed to Archilochus, available whenever you needed to celebrate a victory. And we have what claims to be it in a fragmentary text. You can see it's something that you can sing whenever you want. It's sort of for he's a jolly good fellow. It's equivalent to sort of, happy birthday to you. Or useful, but obviously, as Pindar notes, rather limited, since you want something rather bigger and something much more personalized. You also, and this is the big deal for Pindar, you also want something which will travel. And this is Pindar's shtick about the strength of the Victory Ode. The Victory Ode, says Pindar, can actually travel through space. It can reach anywhere in the world. You need to bear in mind, of course, that Pindar is selling Victory Odes, and therefore what you're dealing with is a bit of effective marketeering. But nonetheless, it's also worth bearing in mind that this is a song culture. As scholars have often emphasized, song travels. It's exchanged between members of the elite. I think the Fifth Nemean of Pindar's is a very important text for one's understanding of what's happening, because I think lyric is traveling up and down the trade routes, as well as when the elite meet in competition or exchange their wives and goods. The demand for victory song, of course, is itself the product of another major cultural change. And what's striking about all of this is the convergence of a large number of evolutionary leaps in Greek culture. And that is the rise of the travelling poet. By the middle of the 5th century, we find poets moving around the Greek world, though often to a limited extent. By the end of the 6th century, you actually have poems which can travel as well as poets, and you have the rise of the complete freelance poet. The other thing that's worth stressing is a point made by Leslie earlier, and that is the secularization of poetry. Choral song, up until this point, has been civic, it's been religious, and what you start to get, as Leslie rightly emphasized, is choral song performed in public space for the honour of living men. So this is a very important cultural change for the rise of the Victory Ode. Again, as with the inscription, it's worth looking at the speed with which the market responds to the new opportunities. There is your timeline for the festivals of the games. 582, 573, it's the first quarter of the 6th century that brings us the Panhellenic festivals. We used to believe that the first professional victory songs were composed by Simonides, probably therefore latter part of the 6th century BC. Increasingly, scholars are suggesting that we can push it back to Ibycus, active round about the middle of the 6th century. If you think about that, it's a remarkably rapid response to the market need. This is just a generation between the rise of the Panhellenic festivals and the emergence of the big professional poets. So remarkably rapid, I think. Now, one of our key sources for the sociology of song is Pindar, and Pindar is very firm that song is much better than material culture. Pythian 6, it's better than architecture. Nemean 5, it's better than statues. As I say, do bear in mind that this man is selling songs, and so one shouldn't regard him as an entirely objective source of information. It is, however, worth bearing in mind that what Pindar is doing when he talks about the extent of song is touching on a real phenomenon, but probably exaggerating it to a striking degree. And that's the mirage that I want to press here. Firstly, I think this insistence that song is better than stone. In fact, a lot of people, certainly some people, probably a lot of them, are actually commissioning both, and therefore the song never replaces the inscription. One needs to beware of taking him too seriously. I think a lot of the competition is perceived by the poets rather than by the stonemasons. If you look at a bit of information with reference to Pindar's Olympian 7, we know that this was inscribed in gold letters, and so people may still have relied very heavily on inscribed text of some sort or another. So he oversells the song as replacement of stone. We should probably also bear in mind that the Victory Ode is likely to be a rarity. I'll offer you a little bit of arithmetic. Pindar may have produced no more than 50 victory songs. Bacchylides, his contemporary and rival, may have produced no more than 20. Simonides, their older contemporary, and Bacchylides' uncle, may have been as prolific as Pindar. Let's come up then with a figure of 120. Let's suppose that we've lost as much as we have. Let's double the figure, therefore, and say that we have perhaps 240. If you look at that over, say, 60 years of the golden age of the Victory Ode, it means probably no more than 4 compositions by a major Panhellenic poet per year. This is never a big industry. It's a luxury market, a narrow market, and of course, that may be the point. It may be very important that hardly anyone gets these things. It's your Fabergé, it's your Cartier. It's not your bog standard stuff. The picture's probably still more complicated than this, because we know that some states never really encouraged the Victory Ode. Sparta, very few. Athens, very few. Disproportionate concentration in some places. The Western colonies, a lot of interest, obviously, connected with issues of ethnicity and identity. The island of Aegina, 25% of Pindar's Victory Odes were produced for Aegina. And of course, that reflects, among other things, the way in which they've cornered the market in martial arts. So what you've got, I think, is a genre which is actually narrowly focused within the Greek world. We tend to buy Pindar's narrative of a very, very widespread distribution. It's probably much more localized, despite the fact that it spreads over. Its extent goes from the whole of Magna Graecia and Eastern Greece. The other interesting thing about this form is its remarkably short lifespan. The Victory Ode careers across the Greek cultural skyline like a meteor and burns out with equal rapidity, despite its disproportionate hold over our imagination. It lasts at most 100 years. Pindar's dead by the middle of the 5th century. Bacchylides is silent by the middle of the 5th century, which means either he's retired or he's dead. We get then a gap. Latest Pindaric Ode 446, we get a gap then of 3 decades before the next Victory Ode, and it's a one-off. Euripides' Victory Ode for Alcibiades, and I think, there we are. It looks like a revival. It looks like a maverick. This isn't a living art form, I think. This is retro. It's difficult to tease out the reasons for this sudden decline. Pindar and Bacchylides are probably dead around the middle of the 5th century. That shouldn't matter. Aeschylus's death doesn't kill tragedy. Aristophanes' death doesn't kill comedy. If there's demand for the genre, it should live on. We can see some squeezing of the market if we look at events in the 5th century. The first, of course, is the fall of the Sicilian tyrannies. They're big business for the Panhellenic poets. The tyranny of Acragas is dead by 471, just 5 years after Pindar produced a masterpiece for one of its members. The tyranny at Syracuse lasts just 3 years longer, and this, of course, is for later Greeks the golden age of Epinicean poetry. Another big change, probably, I think, is the rise of democracies. One shouldn't overstate this, but the rise of democracies within Athens' sphere of influence, which may squeeze the market. Probably more significant, again, the loss of Aeginetan independence in the middle of the 5th century. Big market for the Victory Ode. But if you step back from all of that, it shouldn't matter. The market should decline, should drop, but if this is a living form, it should still survive. Simon Hornblower has researched in great detail the patrons of the great Epinicean poets, and there is a narrative that you'll find in a lot of the textbooks that says basically Pindar's world is dying. It isn't. Democracies are never the majority in Greece. The aristocracies are still there. Pindar's clients continue, the families continue to survive. Diagoras' family active well into the 4th century, for instance. So I don't think that the genre need die out. If one wants to get a sense of what is happening, I think it's worth looking at a couple of important cultural changes, and one of them was the subject of Leslie's paper. For me, I think probably the most significant thing is the change in Greek song culture. We do know that by the latter part of the 5th century, there are big changes in Greek song. Lyric poetry seems to be falling out of favour, at least in some forms. We do know that lyric song is changing. There are radical changes taking place. The forms are loosening up. We're losing the old tight metrical structures. The style is becoming a lot more flamboyant. Now, that in itself need not make a difference to many genres, and in fact, choral Greek song, though people often fail to realize it, continues for centuries after the 5th century BC. It has no difficulty, but that is choral cult Greek song. And I think for genre like the Victory Ode, these literary changes are actually very, very difficult to cope with. We do know from the poets that the victory odes themselves set up tensions, and Leslie Kirk has discussed these at length. They create all sorts of problems, I think, for all that they also have positive benefits. They can create resentment. Now, if you then add to that a very, very flamboyant style, it becomes much more difficult to represent this as a kind of civic voice, and it becomes much more like individual triumphalism. And I think culturally, this probably is the death knell of the victory ode. The other big thing to note is the rise of the athlete statue. The athlete statue starts to appear, as we all know, beginning of the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century. The athlete statue in the Pan-Hellenic shrines. This oughtn't in itself to have a significant impact on the victory ode until you start to realize that with a stone memorial at home and a stone memorial at a shrine visited by the whole Greek world, you have memorialization along the only axis that really ultimately counts. So I think the rise of the Victor statue combined with these cultural changes in poetry ultimately makes it very difficult for this hothouse flower to survive. Whatever the reasons, by the middle of the 5th century, the victory ode is dead. It's becoming a memory. But of course, the story is slightly more complicated than that. If you look at the last item on your handout, you'll see that I've given you a 4th century inscription. And what happens, of course, is that you get a merging of the victory ode with the inscription with which it was competing in the middle of the 6th century. The athletic inscription starts to develop all sorts of elaborate praise motifs. And what you've got, I think, is the ideal compromise. And at this point, one could argue, as my friend Silvia Barbantani has argued, the victory ode hasn't died at all. It's simply morphed into something rather more useful and rather more solid. Thank you.